Well, for those of you that I haven't gotten to know super well, whenever I am not here and not with my family, I have two little girls, a third on the way, which is fun. I'm out playing disc golf. Oh, yeah, thanks. Uh, thanks, Dad. But I'm out playing disc golf. It's a fun game, a lot like regular golf, but a lot cheaper. You can get a disc for like $20 instead of a club for hundreds. You can play for free instead of for like 65, 75. But uh, disc golf, in fact, a few years ago, I was out playing with some friends. We were at a park not too far away. It's called Zuby Park, if you're familiar. And there's a disc golf course out there. It's pretty fun. It's pretty friendly for someone that's new to disc golf. And I went out with some friends, and one of them didn't play much at all. In fact, this was one of the first times he had ever been, and since he had just started, he didn't have any discs of his own, and so I let him borrow some of mine. Now, again, they're not expensive; they're like $20, so there's a little bit of an investment there. And I let him use my discs because he didn't have any. And so, as we're playing, as someone that is new at the game would typically do, he is throwing them as hard as he can, and it's like 5 feet in front of him, again and again and again. And the catch is, as you play at Zuby Park, there's one hole, hole number 11, that you have to throw about 200 feet over a pond. And so I'm positive that by the time we get to this pond, this friend Colton is his name, is not going to be able to make it over the pond. And so as we are preparing for that, we finally get pretty close to the pond and we get up to the tee box where we're going to throw from. And I turn to Colton and I say, Colton, you've seen how you've thrown. I'm proud of you for trying, but you cannot make it past the pond. So just take a stroke and throw from the other side. And he looks me dead in the eye. Trust me. Now, when someone says that, what should you not do or not trust them? So, sure enough, I trust him. So he gets the disc, and I tell you, I thought he was going to throw his back out with how hard he tried to throw this, but he launches and he throws it, and I kid you not, a second doesn't go by, and that thing splashes water straight in. And I'm frustrated. And as a good friend that Colton is, he starts laughing. It's fine. Well, we start to walk around the pond, and look out on the pond, a little irritated, but I notice something strange, and that the disc is floating on the water. They don't float. Somehow, Colton has thrown this disc so poorly that he has hit the water so hard that it has flipped it upside down and it is floating on the pond. There's a little bit of a breeze that's coming across the pond, so we think, okay, if we throw rocks or sticks on the other side of it, we'll kind of scoot it in closer to the edge, and then we can reach out and get it. Because I'm not getting in that water. If you've been out there, you know what the water looks like. It's gross. And so after about 10, 15 minutes of trying to get this disc a little bit closer to the edge, Colton, the trust me guy, gets this massive stick that he is going to launch on the other side of the disc to try and push it further, like, okay, just one big one and go. Well, when he throws it into the water, he throws it on the wrong side of the disc. So all the work that we have just done to get this disc to the edge is immediately undone. After another 20 minutes or so, we finally get the disc very close to the edge. At this point, it's not worth the $20 investment. Just leave it. But there we are trying. And so we finally get it close enough to the edge, but it isn't quite to where you can reach it. In fact, it is so close to the edge that you would need to reach over all of your body weight over the pond, holding onto someone's hand, full weight extended in order to reach the disc. And when we're talking through this, thinking through this, Colton looks me in the eyes and he says, trust me. Now, this Colton is the same one that we've gone to a Mexican food restaurant and I'm dipping my chip in salsa and he has pushed my hand into the salsa. So if trust is the matter here, this is probably not the one to trust. Yet against all logic, here we are that day a few years ago. See if we've got it. There's Colton. There's me leaning over the water. Still got a little ways to go. Not quite there. See, I was lacking trust in that moment. The thing about trust is it can be hard to build, yet easy to tear apart. Trust can take years in order to gain, but then in a moment's notice, it can be gone. Once it's lost, trust is hard to gain back. I'll give you an example a close friend that you've had for many years. You have been people that share everything together. You share secrets. You supported each other through the good times and through the bad. And then one day you confide in them something that is deeply personal that you've told no other person, trusting that they'll keep it a private matter, only to find out that they decided to share it with someone else. In a moment, all of the years of trust have vanished, gone. Because trust is easy to tear apart, but it is incredibly hard to build. And you start to question everything in that scenario. Have they always been this way? Can I ever actually trust them again? They've broken it. Even if they apologize, it's not as simple as just flipping a switch to restore that trust. It takes time, consistency, and it takes effort to rebuild what was lost. What we tend to do is we categorize people in two different ways. We have people that are good and people that we feel as though they're bad. And typically, we start with good until they do something that is bad or that is against us, that loses our trust. And then the moment they become a bad guy, the one that is not trustworthy, it can be incredibly difficult for us to shake them out of that category. That every interaction you have with them is one that starts from a place of lack of trust. The moment you've put them in the category, they can't really rid themselves of it. Can you relate? Have any of you found trust to be difficult with someone before? Or I'll say this way, have you ever been betrayed by a friend, family member? Have you ever experienced the pain of betrayal? Well, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And as we jump in, I want you to consider for a moment, what is that for you? Or rather, who is that for you? I would say it's very likely that as I say the word betray, there's someone that immediately comes to your mind that has hurt you. And I'm not talking about a friend dropping you in a pond because you're trying to get a disc, which I didn't tell the last gathering this. He did not drop me. He actually was trustworthy. We did get the disc. Yeah, all that work. It's not this one. They should have been, but it's not this one. But real betrayal, like someone offending you, hurting you in such a way that you cannot help but be angry when you think about it. Maybe your husband or your wife has kept something from you and you just found out. You aren't sure how to find a path forward. Or you've been so hurt that you can't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness anytime you think about it. Or maybe for you, it's a trusted mentor or leader that lied or manipulated you, led you to believe something that was false. Or maybe it was work on a project at your place of employment that you've spent hours and hours and hours dedicated to this project only for someone to swoop in at the last minute and take the credit for what you did. Maybe a business partner that cheated, that stole from you, that deceived you. Or maybe for you, when you think about betrayal, it stems way back to when you were a child, that someone abused or took advantage of you, someone you're supposed to be able to trust as a kid. You see, the danger is that what this leads to, and we often, what we'll do is we see God through the lens of our interactions with people. That is the way we view God, the way we see God, interact with God, oftentimes is directly correlated with our experiences with people. When we experience betrayal or rejection or hurt from people, especially those we trust, we often project those wounds on to God. If others have let us down, then we believe it's a matter of time, and we just assume that God will do the same. That if people have abandoned us, we fear that God might also abandon us. That the way in which we interact with God is directly correlated with how we interact with people. And it causes us to hold God at a distance, hesitant to trust and afraid to be vulnerable. That's the fear. That the way in which we see God interact with Him, we create a wall between us and between God. And after we experience betrayal, as I'm sure that you have, these questions start to rise to the surface, specifically in relation to God. This is how it correlates. This person betrays you, and you ask, how would God let that happen? Why would He let that happen to me? Why didn't He stop them from hurting me? God, where were you whenever I was betrayed? Why didn't you reveal this to me sooner? And so, in the same way that we put people in this category of good or bad, we do the same with God. The moment that God is no longer good, but we see Him as the enemy, we can't shake Him from that spot. Because every time we look at God, every time we think about God, and we look toward Him, we believe that He is angry. That I must have done something wrong, so He's angry with me. And so, whenever I look toward God, whenever I'm looking toward Him, I can't help but see that. It's the lens with which I now view God. That every time I look at Him, even whenever I try to look up here without seeing this, I can't help but see Him as angry. Which leads us to start feeling as though maybe since He's angry at me, He is just absent. So now, whenever I look to God, I can't see Him because I feel like He's absent. He's not present. Again, the way in which we interact with people is the way in which we view God. That if people betray us, we believe that God will do the same. So as we think about God, we feel as though He's angry and that He's absent, which leads us to this place of being pretty confident that God is just apathetic, really just doesn't care. Because if He cared, He would interact with me in this situation. He would be there for me through this. Because again, we often see God through the lens of people. However, there's a distinction that we need to make this morning, and that's that people aren't a perfect picture of God. Which is why I want to ask you, what if it could look a little different? What if there was a different way forward? A new perspective that we can have, that when we look toward God, we don't see Him as this, but we view Him a little bit differently. We see in Luke chapter 22 that Jesus shows us that there is a new perspective, a new way that we can look at God, a new way forward through betrayal that actually leads us toward forgiveness. But it's a matter of changing our perspective. And it all begins with forgiveness. And forgiveness is important because forgiveness heals what betrayal breaks. Forgiveness heals what betrayal breaks. So that's great, Birdie. So, how do I get there? How do I dig deep to find forgiveness to heal from that betrayal? Well, forgiveness starts with our perspective. Our perspective that once we understand who God really is, it becomes possible to extend forgiveness to others, to be betrayed yet not broken. However, I know that's much easier to say than it is to actually feel. Which is why it's important to first recognize this, that how you feel doesn't necessarily represent what is true. That how you feel doesn't necessarily represent what is true. Our feelings, which are powerful, don't always reflect the whole truth. Betrayal can make us feel alone, that no one, including God, can be trusted, or that forgiveness is impossible. But the truth is that God has not abandoned us. He remains trustworthy, and forgiveness is possible, not because the betrayal wasn't real, but because healing is greater than the hurt. And Jesus shows us this in Luke chapter 22. So if you have your Bible, you can turn there, Luke 22. And in Luke, it's one of the four accounts of Jesus' life, of his acts, of what he did on this earth. And he demonstrates this path forward, a new perspective that we can take on in the most difficult of circumstances. In Luke 22, what we see is that Jesus is about to be betrayed by one of his closest friends, by one of his disciples, Judas. And he's in this point where he could very easily feel as though God was apathetic, was absent, and was angry. Luke 22, starting in verse 39, it says this: And he came out and proceeded as was custom to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples also followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, Pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. So betrayal is impending. It's a matter of moments away. Jesus, knowing what was about to occur, what he does is he withdraws and he prays. And he prays genuinely. God, take this from me. Take it. Will you? Will you remove this from my path? He didn't hold back. He prayed honestly and he prayed openly in the same way that we should approach God, with honesty and with openness. And I think sometimes when we cry out to God, we're too afraid to tell him how we actually feel. Like, I'm hurting. I am broken because of what happened. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. Like, we're often afraid to tell God how we honestly feel. But Jesus approaches God with honesty and with openness, which leads us to our first step in finding forgiveness through betrayal, which is what Jesus did. That's the very first thing in order to find forgiveness from betrayal, is to retreat and reflect. To retreat and reflect. Before reacting, we need to take a step back. What Jesus does is he withdrew to pray in a moment of deep emotion, and we need to do the same. Jesus showed us that the very first thing we must do is bring our pain, bring our anger, and our confusion to God. Let him speak truth into our wounds before we let the bitterness take root. He withdrew to be alone. But our typical response, because we are viewing God through this lens, is that we cry out to him in a sense of blame. We blame him, ask, why would he ever do this? Demand that he fixes it. Because again, we're looking at God as though this is the character of who he is. We're calling out to him, but we can't even see him because this is what we see. But what Jesus does is he completely flips that. He changes the perspective. He shows us that there's another way, but a way that we can only see if we retreat and reflect. To reflect on the goodness of God, to reflect on the works that God has done in our lives, the ways in which he has been present. But he could only see that if he was in intimacy with God, calling out to him honestly. Remembering in Jeremiah 33 that it says, I've loved you with an everlasting love. That the character of who God isn't one who is angry, but he needs to look at it from the different perspective of who God really is. And that is that he is loving. So whenever we look toward God, we don't see that he's angry and play victim, that we start to blame. We say, I'm seeking after a God who I know promises that he is loving. And he has shown me that time and time and time again. But he can only get here by changing the perspective, by retreating and reflecting. But he doesn't just end there. He continues forward in the second half of verse 42 in Luke 22. It says, "Yet not my will, but yours be done. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Minutes, again, before he is betrayed, he says, "Father, I trust you no matter what happens." And if we take a step back, Jesus has every reason to feel as though God is angry, that he's absent, and that he's apathetic. He's in this moment where it could very easily feel as though God has abandoned him. I'm asking, will you take this cup of suffering from me? On top of that, Jesus, one of his closest friends, one of his confidants, is about to betray him to the point of death. This betrayal is leading toward Jesus' death. And so, if there's ever a time someone should feel angry or that God is absent or that God doesn't care about their scenario, Jesus should feel that way. But what he does is he says, "Not my will, but yours be done," which is the second step in finding forgiveness from betrayal, which is that we need to reframe and release. That we reframe our situation and we release the chains. When you think about your unforgiveness and betrayal, and you're holding this weight, who feels that? You or the person that betrayed you? You. It's your weight. It's not impacting them at all whether you hold it or drop it. But Jesus shows us that we can reframe and we can release. He reframes the situation. He says, "I want the cup of suffering taken from me, but your will be done." And he releases his expectation to what God has in store for him, knowing that God has a perfect will and plan, even when he can't see it, even when he can't feel it. God is working. We just sang that God is moving in his midst, but he has to reframe, and he has to release his unforgiveness, release that sense that we have of betrayal, looking at God from the wrong perspective. Take, for instance, the story of Joseph. We read about him in Genesis chapter 37 through 50. If you haven't read it or you're not familiar, I would encourage you to go take a look. But in the story of Joseph, we see that Joseph is this favored son of Jacob, who's also known as Israel. And because he's the favored son, his brothers hate him. They make this plot to kill him, but eventually just sell him into slavery. And through this myriad of trials, Joseph goes from being sold into slavery to being wrongfully accused of assault, to being imprisoned, but eventually he ends up in this position of power as he reframes and he releases this unforgiveness toward his brothers, as he doesn't hold on to the frustration and find himself stalled out by the anger. He finds himself in this position of power, and he ends up at the very end of the book of Genesis with a choice. He can choose forgiveness or he can choose retribution. In this position of power, his brothers have to come to him seeking after food. And he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And this is what he says in Genesis chapter 50. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present rule, to preserve many people alive." Because Joseph was in his position of power, he was able to lead this group of people through a famine. You meant evil, yet God meant it for good. And by reframing and releasing, we can ask God to help us to see his hand even in our hardship, even in the difficulty, even through betrayal. And I want to make it clear that releasing the offense doesn't excuse the offense. By releasing what someone has betrayed you from does not excuse that it happened, but it does free you from being chained to it. It's your choice to be chained up to your unforgiveness or not. When we release an offense, it doesn't excuse it, but it frees us from it. Betrayal narrows our focus to the hurt, but forgiveness starts to shift our perspective. And it isn't until we rightly see God that we can then emulate it toward our relationship with others. If we always feel as though God is angry, as God is absent, and as God is apathetic, then we will have no frame of reference to treat or interact with people differently or ever seek a place of forgiveness. To find that forgiveness in our heart. By reframing and releasing, Jesus continues to show us that maybe God is what he says he is, which is near. And that from this new perspective, we're not looking at God in the sense of blame. But when we look toward him, this wall isn't about anger and absence. It's about love and how God is near. That verse in Jeremiah 33, loved with an everlasting love, but also says drawn with an unfailing kindness. That God has drawn you to himself, and he's near, even in those moments of betrayal. And for Jesus, even when his circumstances didn't make sense, even when his fear felt overwhelming, even with all that was happening, Jesus chose to see his circumstances through what he knew to be true about God instead of changing what he thought about God based on what he experienced or felt. He started with the truth and let his feelings follow suit. You see, it takes an extraordinary amount of trust in God to face these extraordinarily difficult circumstances, to process through betrayal in a healthy way. It has everything to do with our perspective. Instead of letting our feelings dictate our perspective, we let truth change us. But we have to look at it from a different point of view. And I'm not excusing any wrong that has been done to you. I'm saying it's okay, just let it go. But the weight that you're holding doesn't have to weigh you down anymore. That instead of feeling like God is angry toward you, you can know that you have a heavenly Father who loves you dearly. Instead of feeling in this situation that God is absent, you can know that he is near. And ultimately, instead of feeling like he is apathetic, you can know that you have a God who is caring. How do you know that? Because he promises it. And he is a promise keeper, changing our perspective, helping us see it from a different point of view. Why would God make you, design you uniquely if he didn't care? Well, the simple answer is he wouldn't. And what scripture says is it says that you are his masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do the good things that he planned long ago. That you are purposed, which means he cares about you. He sees you in your situation. He sees you in the difficulty. Why is this significant? Well, because it isn't until we change our perspective toward God that we can then emulate rightly that character toward others. If we never start seeing God as one who loves, who is near, and is caring, we can never get over the hurdle of our unforgiveness and betrayal. Because as we are continuing to see God through this lens of we are angry, he's angry with us, that he is absent, and that he's apathetic, we're never going to be led to this place where we can actually truly forgive. because we project that onto others, project anger on the betrayer, project absence, and project apathy. If I just stop thinking about it, it will go away. And that leads us to our last step in forgiveness through betrayal. It's to rebuild and restore. Jesus chose to choose trust. As it continues in Luke 22, now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently. And his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. That God was there to provide comfort doesn't mean that it was easy. Doesn't mean that it was simple to get through. Sweating drops of blood, difficult. When we consider that unforgiveness that might be in our hearts to the one that has betrayed us, we feel like, well, if I let go of that, then I'm losing because I need retribution for what they've done. But you don't have to hold on. And when we consider letting go is not losing. What it is it's gaining peace, freedom from those chains, freedom from the weight that is holding us down, freedom to step into forgiveness. You know what's incredible that Jesus shows us is how he responds specifically to Judas, the betrayer. In the book of Matthew, we see that Jesus responds to Judas as he is betraying him. And he says this in Matthew chapter 26, verse 15, it said, and Jesus said to him, friend. Friend? Friend, do what you have come for. And then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. He calls Judas friend. Grace, even in the face of betrayal. How did he do that? Well, because he sees life and he sees people from a different perspective. You see, forgiveness isn't forgetting the betrayal or ever pretending that it didn't hurt. It's choosing to let God heal what others have broken. When we retreat and reflect, we give our wounds to Him. When we reframe and release, we refuse to let the betrayal define us. And I just wonder, how long have you let a betrayal from someone define you? To dictate how you feel and how you function and how you interact with anyone else. That you've been wrongfully hurt by someone. You were once married and it fell apart. And now every time you try and get into a relationship, you reflect back of the hurt that you faced and you won't let yourself get close with anyone again. Letting this betrayal define you. But God says there is a different way. Jesus shows us that we don't have to hold on to that. Judas betrayed him, and because of it, Jesus died. But he calls him friend. And he can only do that because he has this intimacy with God, knowing that he is loving, knowing that he is near, and knowing that he cares so much. When we rebuild and restore, we step into a freedom that only forgiveness can bring. And I'm not diminishing what has happened to you. But I truly believe that in any circumstance, there is an opportunity, a route for reconciliation through any betrayal. I know that because what happened to Jesus? The ultimate betrayal. But reconciliation, it takes two parts, working toward it together. But forgiveness does not equal reconciliation. You may not have the opportunity to reconcile with the one that betrayed you because they're no longer living. But why hold the weight of the unforgiveness anymore? Or perhaps you're sitting here today and you're the betrayer. This is true for you too. You are loved, God is near, and He cares. And only when we look at Him from that perspective can things begin to change. Can we let go of the bitterness and the frustration and the anger? Forgiveness frees our heart to heal and to move forward. And when we look at it from this way, when we seek God through retreat and reflection, when we drop the weight by reframing and releasing, we can then move toward healing and the rebuild and the restoration of our heart and of our mind, seeking after God and finding freedom from the betrayal. And He shows us the way forward. But it's a choice. Choosing to seek after Him, choosing to have intimacy. You don't get any of this without intimacy. I heard someone once say the corniest way of talking about intimacy, but I'm going to say it anyway. Intimacy is into me you see. Intimacy, you see into me. It's closeness. But if you don't spend time with God, you don't get here. All you can ever look at is this. And then you're frustrated, you're upset, you're angry because He's nowhere to be seen. He doesn't even care. And you know He's angry and you don't care anymore because you're angry back at Him. But intimacy can change our perspective. If you heard nothing I said, remember that step one is to seek God. Seek Him. Drop the weight, and then you can find forgiveness.